Greetings and salutations, Greek students. We continue our study of the Greek New Testament by turning our attention to another form of participles. We've already seen the present active and the present middle passive participles. We've seen the aorist active and the aorist middle participles. In this lecture, what I want to do is introduce us to the aorist passive participle as well as the perfect active and perfect middle passive participles. So this is continued introduction to the participles. If you're following along in the grammar, it's N. Clayton Croy's Primer of Biblical Greek, lesson number 20. Let's get into it. So the aorist passive participle, just like we saw with the aorist passive indicative, the thein, theis, they, themin, theti, theson, has that theta as part of the morphological change that happens. Just as we saw with the aorist active and the aorist middle participle, you don't have an epsilon prefix. So normally when you're reading along and you come across that verb with an epsilon prefix, your mind, the red lights are flashing and you're going, oh, I know. I'm looking at either an imperfect or I'm looking at an aorist. But in the case of the participles, you don't have that epsilon prefix. So you're looking at those endings to determine, or the stem change to determine what kind of verb do I have happening here. The aorist passive participle forms, no epsilon prefix. In the masculine is going to be that theis, thentos, thenti, thenta, thentes, thentone, thesin, thentas in the masculine. In the feminine, thesa, these, these, theson, thesai, theson, thesis, thesas. In the neuter, then, thentas, thenti, then, thenta, thentone, thesin, thenta. So that thes, thesa, then, which is not all that different from the aorist sas, sasa, san, or even the imperfect on, usa, on. So you're beginning to see kind of the pattern emerge of the present participles, the aorist participles, and now here, of course, we've seen the aorist middle. Now, of course, the aorist passive participle. Having been loosed is how you're going to translate this, or having been taught, or having been found, or having been this aorist, right? So it's undefined past action, but it's also so it's in the past, but it's passive, right? The subject of this participle is receiving the action, not performing the action. So a couple of examples from the New Testament here in Acts 4:8. Tate Petros pleis theis pneumatos hagiou epen pros autun. So this is then Petros, our old friend Peter, and he's of course doing in this instance, by the time we get into Acts, he's looking heroic. Then Peter, and we have this, this is from the verb pleis theis, is from the verb pemplemi, which is one of those me verbs. We haven't actually seen these yet, so I'm not going to decline it for you because it would just confuse you. But you can see this theis ending. So then Peter, having been filled, and having been filled, pneumatos hagiou, having been filled with pneumatos, the Holy Spirit. And actually, technically, this is the genitive, so it's sort of, instead of maybe being filled with, you could say being filled of, but it's the idea of having been filled up, full of what? What's he full of? He's full of the Holy Spirit, full of the Holy Spirit, epen pros autus, said to them. So in this instance, as we've seen with these participles, this is an adverbial participle. It's describing the action that Peter is having been full of the Holy Spirit when he spoke. In the second example from Matthew 11:4, ha Jesu epen autois poreuthentes ap angelete ione a acuete kai blepete. Now this is when Jesus speaks to the disciples of John the Baptist while John the Baptist is in prison, and he's kind of wondering, hey, Jesus, are you the guy that I thought you were? Because I'm still sitting here in prison, and that's not what I expected from the Messiah. Are you the one to come, or should I be looking for someone else? And so Jesus said to them, ha Jesus epen autois. This is the technically the Jesus said to them, but the common way of doing it. Jesus And you like to have the definite article because it's identifying with names that are often undeclined. What case are these names? This is the subject. Jesus said to them, that is to the disciples of John the Baptist. And he's setting up the command apangelete, announce or tell. This is an imperative, but the aorist passive participle, it's from poruomai. And so in this case, what's actually happening is the passive participle is being used because it's deponent. So having said to them, after having gone, or after going, tell John what, we haven't seen this relative pronoun, what akuete you hear and you see. And so this is just, again, one of those examples where you have the aorist passive participle after having gone. Now, in this case, the passive is being used because we've got one of those deponent verbs, poruomai. So we can have these traditional passives having been filled, or the middle passive deponent, poruomai, functioning like in its active form, right? So we wouldn't say after being gone, but after going, you're supposed to tell John what you see and hear. We also have perfect active participles. Now, if you recall, in the aorist passive, the aorist active participles, you don't see that epsilon prefix. But when it comes to the perfect participle, you still have the reduplication, which is really helpful because the reduplication helps identify the aorist. It's like this dead giveaway. So in the masculine, lelukos, lelukatas, lelukati, lelukata, lelukates, lelukaton, lelukasi, lelukatas in the masculine. In the feminine, leluquia, leluquias, leluquia, leluquian, leluquii, leluquion, leluquiis, leluquias, and that's the feminine. In the neuter, lelukas, lelukatas, lelukati, lelukas, lelukata, lelukaton, lelukasi, lelukata. And the fun thing about these perfects is they're kind of fun to say because you get that reduplication in there. And this is having already loosed. So again, with the perfect tense, you're thinking present state, past action. Always, when you're talking about participles, the timing of the verb as it relates to the main verb of the sentence, right? So the participle's timing is always defined in relationship to the main verb of the sentence. The perfect middle passive. So unlike the aorist, which has a middle form and a passive form, which are separate, the perfect participle, like the present, has a middle passive. So it's going to be middle or passive, and you'll have to know based on context. And again, I think you're getting by now that when you see these middle passives, you're almost always going to be in the passive, or if you're not in the passive, you're looking at one of those deponents, that is middle passive in form but active in meaning. So it seems annoying that the middle and the passive are separate forms, but it actually doesn't end up being that difficult to figure out based on context what you're looking at. So again, in the perfect middle passive, you've got the reduplication. And just like you had my, sai, tai, methisthe, and tai in the perfect passive, in the indicative, the lelu, menos, meno, menon, lelu, menoi, menon, menois, menus. You have these endings that you expect to see already in the present middle passive, but the main identification is that you have that reduplication and you've dropped one of your vowels. The omicron has kind of fallen out here. But otherwise, these forms are almost exactly what you would expect them to be. And again, having loosed oneself in the middle, or having been loosed, present state of having been loosed, whereas the perfect is having already loosed. I want to review quickly the primary function of the participle. Now, these primary functions are not limited to the perfect or the aorist passive. The primary functions of the participle relate to all the forms of the participle. So, of course, we have the attributive participle, and this is when the participle, like an adjective, attributes a quality to a noun. So which apostle are we talking about? We're talking about the one who says these things, that knows the Lord. That's the apostle that we're talking about, the one who says these things. The substantive, in this case, the participle can be used also like an adjective as a substantive noun, those being seen. And normally when you see this, normally you're going to see this in the nominative or the accusative case, but it can occur in others. But this is when the participle functions basically like a noun. The adverbial use of the participle, this is where you have the circumstances of the main verb. Now, the defining features of the adverbial participle is there's not going to be a definite article, and the participle is going to be in a predicate position. So adverbial participles are most often found in dependent clauses that indicate the context, cause, or circumstances of the main verb, sometimes also called the circumstantial participle. So you're going to want to translate this in the present tense with a while or a when, in the aorist with a having or an after, sometimes because, and the perfect tense, similar, is that after, right? Because it's the action is prior to, it's a present state, the resulting state that set the conditions for the main verb in context. So present participles, contemporaneous action. Aorist and perfect participles are antecedent action. And again, of course, as we've talked about, the main verb is going to influence how to translate the participle. So if you have a present tense main verb and a present tense participle, they're contemporaneous. You're going to get wow. But if you have a present tense main verb and an aorist, a present tense participle and an aorist main verb, the participle, even though it's in the present tense, is happening at the same time as the main verb. So you can't move the present tense participle forward in time. It has to be, it's present with the main verb, not present in the sort of stance of the reader of the text. And of course, we've talked about the genitive absolute, these participles that are genitive and are usually at the beginning, although they don't have to be. Sometimes they're at the end. Occasionally they're in the middle of a sentence, but mostly they're going to be set apart at the very beginning of a sentence, which separate it from the rest of the sentence and provide context around the main action of the sentence, the main subject, verb, action of the sentence. We also have, this is kind of new, periphrastic participles. These are when an arthrous participle is used with a be verb. So this basically, periphrastic, peri means to, and phrasis is speech, to talk around something. And so this is the kind of thing that your grammar teacher wouldn't like you to say. So I am loosing the slave. You don't need the I am. You don't need the be verb. You can leave it out, but you sort of is a roundabout way of saying this. So New Testament example, Matthew 7:29, ein gar didaskon autus hos exousion echon kai uk hos hoi grammates, auton. So in this instance, this is the third person singular imperfect form of a me, I am, but he, she, it was. For he was, this is talking about Jesus, teaching. Now you could just say, a did ask on sa, a didaske, and then you would just have the imperfect, he was teaching. So the periphrastic participle in this case looks just like the imperfect form of the verb, but it's just a different way of saying it. For he was teaching autus, them, hos exousion echon, as having exousion, authority, and not hos, and not as their scribes. Right? So this is talking about the difference between Jesus' teaching and the scribes' teaching, that he teaches as one having authority and not as the scribes who are going to be citing, well, this person says, and this person says, and this person says. No, Jesus speaks with authority. Another example, Ephesians 2:8, famous text, te gar chariti, for by grace, chariti, you are, and this is the present tense, second person plural, y'all are, sesomenoi, perfect passive participle, having been passive, saved. So you are having been saved, dia pisteos, through faith. So again, you have this periphrastic participle where you take the me verb, the a me verb, and you combine it with the participle, in this case, a perfect passive participle, to get the sort of roundabout way of saying you are having been saved. So just different ways of doing it. You do see periphrastic participles. They're not especially common, but they do occur in the New Testament. Good to be aware of them. So when we're reviewing the different ways in which participles can function, we're going to, of course, see participles functioning kind of like attributive adjectives describing nouns. We're going to see them functioning like substantive adjectives, basically functioning as nouns. We're going to often see them as adverbial participles, participles that are describing the circumstances of a verb. And then quite a few genitive absolutes. Less frequently, but still occurring, are these periphrastic participles. So that introduces us to the syntax of participles, kind of gives us the range of the participle syntax, as well as gets us not only the present, the aorist middle, but also the aorist passive and the perfect participles. So we've seen the full gamut of what participles can look like for the most part in the New Testament.